Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Discover Willamette Valley webinar for Oregon Wine Month. I am joined today, I'm Bree Stock. I'm the Education Director with the Oregon Wine Board, and I am a Master of Wine, and I am joined today by Julia Burke from Willamette Wines. Julia is also an accomplished wine educator as well, and she holds the Wine and Spirit Education Trust Diploma certification. And so she's fantastic to have here on this webinar today with us. I'm going to ask you all, if you have any questions, to pop them into the chat for Julia. And also, let us know where you're from and, what's happening out there. Say hi to everyone. See how many people we've got from all over the world. I think we had 6 or 7 different countries tuning in for the last Oregon Wine Month webinar. And I know we've got a lot of attendees registered for this program. So please throw all your questions into the chat, and Julia is going to, my very lovely co-host, is going to chime in with all the information that she has about the Willamette Valley, being that she lives and breathes and works it every day of her life. She's the Marketing and Communications Manager with Willamette Valley Wineries Association. Thanks for being here, Julia.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, let's jump in because we have quite a bit to get through today. And I will let you all know that this is being recorded, and it will be, a link will be sent out to you all, and it will also be available on the Oregon Trade website YouTube channel as well. So you'll be able to find it and rewatch it if you need to as well, if you can't make the seminar this morning. Okay, let's jump in. So Discover Willamette Valley today. I've split this up into sort of 3 groupings based on a little bit of how, the Willamette Valley actually talks about itself and really fits within the Oregon wine landscape. So we've broken it out into renowned, innovative, and collective, which, is really collaborative. Let's face it, if you know anything about the Willamette Valley wine industry, is that they are all each other's biggest fans, and they love getting together to collaborate on wines and different education subjects as well. So this is how we've broken it out. The first little section, we're going to run through the renowned. We're going to touch on some of the wine quality, the high quality scores that Willamette Valley and Oregon wine receives. The commitment to Pinot Noir within the valley, the climate of the Willamette Valley, the soils of the Willamette Valley, and we're also going to really talk about the distinctive styles that come from within the nested AVAs. The Willamette Valley has the most nested AVAs within Oregon, and so, there's more than 50 years of wine growing here in this valley, and so people are really starting to understand their site and their place and what that means in terms of farming and viticulture and the quality and style of wines that come from each individual AVA. So we're going to dive into that. And again, put any questions you have into the chat, and Julia's going to do her best to answer as many as you can. And if there's pertinent ones, Julia, please, jump in and either answer yourself or just interrupt me and ask me a question, and we'll go through it that way.
Will do. Sounds good.
Great. Okay, so just to familiarize you all, we are in Oregon, where the state wedged between Washington and California on the West Coast, west of Idaho. We have 21 AVAs in Oregon, and our largest AVA is the Willamette Valley. It is also our oldest AVA, and it now has 9 nested AVAs. So it's a very important AVA in terms of history, in terms of production, in terms of the the wine styles that you're getting out of here, and also in terms of where the most growers and winemakers are that are really, getting to understand their intimately their piece of place, and conveying that to all of you with their wines in the market. So as you can see here, the Willamette Valley is really, surrounding Portland. It stretches basically from the Columbia River in the north down to past Eugene in the south, past Salem, the capital of Oregon. It's the oldest AVA established in 1983, and it's nearly 3.5 million acres in size. So it's a large AVA, and you can see from this map just how many little river valleys we really do have in this area. And while there's currently 9 nested AVAs within the Willamette Valley, there is a growing number of submissions to the TTB for new AVA sites. And while there's not too many south of Salem at the moment, I can tell you that there will likely be more of these appearing in the next few years as growers tend to work together down there to really carve out these pieces of geographical area and understanding them and submitting them for nested AVA approval within the Willamette Valley. So lots to come, but let's first focus on what we already have here, the 9 AVAs. So I'll get into those a little more, but I just wanted to get you to familiarize yourself with the Willamette Valley, and that most of the nested AVAs are located in the northern part of the appellation. So large AVA, there's just over 25,000 acres planted, and there's more going in the ground every year, which is really exciting for us. There's plenty of land to be planted here and plenty of hillsides. Most of the vineyards are on hillsides, and all of the nested AVAs must be from 200 feet elevation up to 1,000 feet elevation. And some are pushing those boundaries as well as climate change continues to allow us to explore higher, cooler sites. So it accounts for 68% of the state's total planted vineyards. Pinot Noir is the dominant grape variety, and then the usual suspects follow. So Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling is sadly in decline, but we have other exciting varieties coming up through the Willamette Valley. So Gamay Noir, Aligoté, a lot more Chardonnay, and Syrah, and even other varieties like Cabernet Franc, Blaufränkisch, Grüne Veltliner. There's a whole host of varieties that are being planted, and we're really only limited by growers' imaginations for what can grow here. It's a cool northerly climate, but it does have a lot of sunshine and the ability to get everything very ripe during the growing season. So as I mentioned earlier, we are kind of renowned for the quality that comes out of our state in terms of wine production. So Oregon only makes around 1% of the domestic wine in the marketplace, but we have 7% on, I think that's increasing in the Wine Spectator's top 100 wines in 2020. So that's a pretty amazing feat for a little small production state. As I say though, there's a lot more plantings going into the ground, so keep an eye out for more Oregon wine in your marketplace. There's also growing consumer demand for Oregon wine. So even though we're small production wineries and family estates made from hand-picked fruit, consumers are really seeking out Oregon wine, and the average bottle price in comparison to Washington and California is quite a bit higher. So it's a good value proposition for any of you on-trade or retailers out there. And this shows the Nielsen retail volume growth between 2018 and 2019. And I know that Danny Brager just gave us some new information, and I think we're up around the 14% growth mark for 2020. Pinot Noir, as I mentioned earlier, This is the region's #1 grape variety, and it really is the flagship variety for Oregon. It makes a very distinctive style within the Willamette Valley, and there's really no other region in the world that is so committed to a single grape variety. It makes up 95% of the Willamette Valley's red wine production, red wine grape plantings, and there's 50,000 tons produced or higher. Even when you look at Burgundy, they actually grow a lot more Chardonnay and produce a lot more Chardonnay than they do Pinot Noir. So Willamette Valley is really pretty unique in terms of its commitment to this single grape variety. Let's also talk about the uniqueness of the soils in the Willamette Valley and what they contribute in terms of style to the wines. So there's 3 distinctive soil types that you need to remember, and generally speaking, the nested AVAs are really sort of formed around these soil types. So marine sedimentary, the marine sedimentary soils were on the bottom of the ocean 200 million years ago when the Pacific Ocean spread all the way to Idaho and Montana. And then around 16 million years ago, the tectonic plates smacked together, pushing the Cascade Mountains, forming the Cascade Mountain Range and pushing all of that sedimentary soil up out of the water and really forming the West Coast states. So marine sedimentary soils that are very prominent throughout the growing region of the Willamette Valley are very prominent. They're very well drained, free draining soils. They're fairly low in nutrients, which is actually pretty helpful in a region where we have a lot of rainfall during the winter. So we can have pretty vigorous grapevines and soils. And the marine sedimentary soils really allow an earlier onset of vine development in terms of when the vine comes back to life in the spring, and gives a slightly longer growing season for vineyards planted on marine sedimentary soils. So
we had sorry to interrupt, we had a question in the chat that I thought was interesting about why are most of the vineyards over 200 feet of elevation, and that is just that the valley floor is so much more fertile. It's just so important in our region to control vigor. And just as Bree's been saying, that the valley floor part of it is not going to have as many of these really free draining soils. And that's where you're going to find more agricultural products like hazelnuts, things that can handle a little bit more vigor.
Yeah, exactly. And this is actually a really, good time to go on to the next slide, which we're still talking about the soils, but you can actually see how they play out in the AVAs. And as Julia was saying, below that 200 feet elevation level tends to be the Missoula Flood soils. And so those Missoula Flood soils are primarily really nutrient-rich loam soils, which are much better suited to growing hazelnuts, or filberts as they're called here in Oregon, and also grass seed. We're the grass seed capital of the world here. So there's a lot of mixed agriculture that's happening on the valley floors. But as we all know, vines like to struggle a little bit. So they don't like to be, over invigorated, which is what happens on these loam soils. We would just be spending all of our time trying to manage the canopies and spending far too much time actually in the vineyards, trying to maintain the canopy growth. So it's mostly hillside and sort of mountaintop positions for the vineyards in the Willamette Valley. So going back to the soil series, the volcanic soils were really created around 16 million years ago when those tectonic plates collided. And between that time and the next ice age, there was a series of volcanic activity where hundreds of volcanoes really spewed lava across the Pacific Northwest, primarily eastern Washington and northern Oregon. And it really, all of these continued lava flows, these basalt lava flows, really weighed down eastern Washington and the northern parts of the Willamette Valley. So the volcanic soils, the basalt soils, don't really spread below or further than the Willamette Valley AVA because of those natural volcanic activity that happened all along the Cascade Mountain range millions of years ago. So once we've got the volcanic soils in place, we still have the sedimentary soils that are uplifted in places, but tend to be at slightly lower elevations or where the region has buckled, and you can see those sedimentary soils have come through the volcanics. Then we had the Ice Age, and then around 10,000 years ago, we had the Missoula Floods. So between that time, between the Ice Age and the Missoula Floods, we have the loess activity happening. So all of this wind-blown loess soil was really blown down the Columbia River Valley, and that whole Columbia River Valley was really deepened and widened by these repeated Ice Age thawing and refreezing that led to the Missoula Floods. But through that time, and you still see when you're in the Columbia River Valley, and we get it in the top of the northern Willamette AVA, a real impact from these winds that blow down the Columbia River. So those winds that come down deposited all of these very fine-grained loess soils in the Tualatin Hills AVA and the Laurelwood District AVA, which is what the actual soil series is known as here in Oregon. It's Laurelwood. So they're two of our newest AVAs, which we'll go into in a little bit deeper. But just keep in mind that there's three major soil types in the Willamette Valley, and they really do impact the growing conditions, how you farm, and also the stylistic characteristics of the Pinot Noir and other grape varieties that are produced on them. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the contributions to the palate shape and texture when we get into the actual AVAs. So moving on, this is a very quick rundown and fairly general profile of what the loess, sedimentary, and volcanic soils all contribute to Pinot Noir styles. So only Pinot Noir flavor profiles here. So in the loess soils, they tend to be a little more high acidity and racy and brisk. They can have sort of a chalky rustic tannin profile, but lots of red berry fruits, very approachable, easy drinking styles of Pinot Noir coming from the loess soils primarily. And then the sedimentary soils, as I mentioned, they tend to ripen, allow the vines to begin their life in spring a little earlier. So you tend to get a little more ripeness coming off of the sedimentary soils. So the alcohols tend to be higher, the acids tend to be softer, the tannins are very resolved and fully ripe. And then you tend to get flavors of, blood orange and citrus, but all the way through also to like blackberry and black plum, and then quite exotic cinnamon and floral lavender flavors as well. And then the volcanic soil series are really the most structured of the Pinot Noir styles, and the ones that you would probably say that, I'm going to put these away in the cellar and let them age a little bit before I really dig into them. So a lot of more structured tannins, more tea-like tannins, fairly fresh acidities. Depending on which AVA, you can get a very distinctive sort of root beer or cola or sarsaparilla flavor to the palate. But think more of those darker flavors for the volcanic soils and a little bit more structure. But again, know your producer, because it all comes down to as well is the hand of the winemaker. So how they handle the picking decisions, what they do in the cellar, and their barrel profiles or barrel maturations programs are really important to how the styles come through as well. So this is just a nice generalization of the styles. The other important consideration in the Willamette Valley is our growing season. And this is really, why we're so distinctively different to Burgundy and also to Sonoma, where, you know, we're really, you know, comparing sort of our Pinot Noir profiles. The Willamette Valley has really, really cold, wet winters, not cold enough to create freeze, but we really rely on these very damp, heavily rainfall laden winters to get us through the growing season. Because as you can see from this chart here, the rainfall during the growing season is pretty low. So between April and October, there's less than 3 inches a month falling. So in generally speaking, if you're in Burgundy, they're kind of getting 3 inches sort of every single month. So they're getting a lot more cloud cover, a lot more rainfall. And in Oregon, we're getting the very dry period where we have very low disease pressure, which is also why there are so many sustainable vineyards in Oregon and organic and biodynamic vineyards. We don't really need to spray as heavily as they do in these cooler, wetter summer areas like Burgundy and Sonoma. So we have a nice dry growing season that really allows our grapes to get fully ripe. And you see that in the fruit profiles. You know, even though we're actually cooler from a temperature standpoint than Burgundy, we actually have you know, a lot more ripeness and generally higher alcohols in our Pinot Noir and in general in our fruits, because we get so much sunshine, a nice warm dry summer, and lots of UV light. So we know that vines really need both heat and light to actually bring full maturity and flavor development, and we have an abundance of that in the Willamette Valley. So really important and really distinctive for the Willamette Valley climate. And then this is the day length. So as you can see here, we get a couple more hours than Sonoma, and we're almost in line with Beaune in terms of the day length during the growing season. But again, the most important thing here is that we have clear blue skies, and so have a lot of UV light shining in on our grape bunches, whereas in Beaune or Burgundy, they have a lot more cloud cover and really don't get that UV impact to fully ripen the phenolics in the grapes and the tannins. So that's why we have, you know, tend to have more rounded, more fruity styles of wine, higher tannins, higher alcohols than in general in Burgundy, except depending if you go up to high elevations, then that all changes. So again, know your producer, know your vineyard, as with every region. And then the next contribution from a climatic standpoint is really the winds. So the Willamette Valley does sit on the eastern side of the Coast Range, which is a fairly low-lying coastal range that really does protect some buffering from the Pacific Ocean winds and some of the rain systems that come in across that Coast Range. But there are enough gaps and valleys in the Coast Range that we receive a heap of wind coming down these corridors. And I would actually add on here, we have the Van Duzer corridor in the southern part of the northern nested AVAs coming down exactly over the Van Duzer corridor AVA and blowing across McMinnville and into the north of the Eola Amity Hills. So that's a very strong coastal influence corridor where you can actually time your watch to when the winds come through from that Pacific Ocean influence in the afternoons and cool down the vineyards. So you get a very warm day, a very warm drying out of the vineyards in that area, but then in the afternoon, you get a very cooling influence coming through from the winds, and again, continuing to dry out those vineyards so that we don't have a lot of disease pressure. I would also probably add in the north, just to the west of the Tualatin Hills AVA, the Tillamook corridor, because it's a very similar corridor to the Van Duzer corridor. And if you followed that highway out to the coast, it's about the same mileage from Van Duzer, which is less than 50 miles to the Pacific Ocean. It's about the same from the Tualatin Hills AVA, about 50 miles out to the coast. And that Tualatin Tillamook corridor really funnels a lot of cool oceanic winds in through that corridor into the northern part of the valley, impacting, of course, the Tualatin Hills AVA, but it also impacts the Yam Hill Carlton and the Shasta Mountains AVA as well. So they're the cooling influences that come in from the west. And then there's a very easterly wind that blows down the Columbia River Gorge. And at certain times of year, this wind in the growing season will be very hot. It's funneling all of this hot eastern weather and eastern winds down the Columbia River Gorge to the top of the Willamette Valley AVA. So through Portland into the Shasta Mountains and the Dundee Hills. And you can really feel these winds are quite warm and almost like convection oven or inferno-like in August when they hit. And so we are really a region that is quite balanced by the wind influences in the valley. And you never have more than, say, 7 days of very hot weather. It's usually around 4 or 5. I would like it to be 7, but it's usually around 4 or 5. And then you get the Pacific Ocean pushing back. So there's this constant yin and yang push and pull vacuum formation that happens with the winds and the weather systems, the high pressure systems that come through the Willamette Valley. So super important for our grape growing, for the quality of our grapes, and for our ability to be really sustainable and low impact in the vineyard. Okay, let's move into the actual AVAs and talking about the styles of wine that are made in these AVAs. So this is the Shasta Mountains AVA. It was one of the first AVAs, or one of the first nested AVAs. It's a fairly large region, and it's a pretty mixed region in terms of the soil types here. And that's why you actually see this AVA starting to be carved up into more distinctive individual AVAs. So obviously Ribbon Ridge has been a nested AVA for quite some time and is one of the smallest AVAs in Oregon. But the newest one is Laurelwood, and that is in the north. So you can see all of that low soil around the Laurelwood district, but the rest of the AVA is really volcanic jori soils, so basaltic jori soils. And this AVA is really important historically. It has some of the original founding vineyards and wineries in the Willamette Valley. So Shasta Mountains Vineyard was established in 1968 by Dick Erath and is continued to be farmed and expanded. The Adelsheim Winery was the first winery in the Shasta Mountains AVA. And of course, within the Laurelwood district, Dick and Nancy Ponzi established Ponzi Vineyards and Winery in the late 70s, early 80s, late 70s. So that's a really important, some really important vineyard sites and wineries within the Shasta Mountains. As I mentioned earlier, you get the winds coming in from the north across the Laurelwood district, which is why all those low soils are there. And these tend to be fairly drying. And so there's a real opportunity to pick depending on certain ripening parameters. The depth of the soils, the depth of the low soils and the volcanic soils in the Shasta Mountains AVA means that the vines can go pretty deep actually. And so they have a good water reserve and the wines tend to retain pretty good freshness of acidity and really pretty like red berry fruit flavors, sort of red licorice strap, raspberry, cranberry, very delicate styles of Pinot Noir until you move into Ribbon Ridge, which is sedimentary soils. And these can, be sort of fleshier, more lush styles of Pinot Noir coming from the Ribbon Ridge AVA. We'll talk about that on its own, as with the Laurelwood district. Where those volcanic soils are present that you can see on that map is really higher elevation sites. So the Shasta Mountains AVA has some of the highest elevation vineyards in the Willamette Valley on Parrot Mountain, which is the head of the dinosaur standing on its head. The little round area is really that high elevation volcanic soils, still really heavily forested and mountainous. But the Chehalem Ridge and Eagle Bluff, which it's called, really helps to actually protect all of those AVAs that you can see to the west of the Chehalem Mountains AVA. So the Dundee Hills, Ribbon Ridge, and Yam Hill Carlton are sort of lower elevation AVAs that are protected by the ridge line of the Chehalem Mountains AVA. So that also contributes, the elevation, the wind influence, all contributes to a freshness of style and acidity and a brightness of red fruit flavors coming from the Pinot Noir specifically in this AVA. And generally, we find a lot more aromatic varieties in this AVA as well. There's still a lot of Riesling planted here, Pinot Gris, and even Gruner Veltliner is planted in the Chehalem Mountains. So they really thrive in this sort of cooler climate and higher elevation region as well. Okay, and there's a beautiful image of the Ridgecrest Vineyard, which is Harry Peterson Nedry, and a really old vine vineyard there. You can see the hills in the background, still fairly forested, and that's the Eagle Bluff up in the background there. So you can see how some of these vineyards are really protected by the winds from where they're positioned in the AVA. So moving into Ribbon Ridge. So Ribbon Ridge was the first nested AVA within the Chehalem Mountains AVA. And Ribbon Ridge is really fully sedimentary soils. It's a slightly lower elevation AVA with protection coming from around the Chehalem Mountains and also Yam Hill Carlton. But these sedimentary soils are pretty low in nutrients, so the vines are not overly vigorous here. They begin their life fairly early, and they ripen fairly early as well, but pretty exotic, pretty plush, really approachable styles of wine coming from the Ribbon Ridge AVA. This AVA is actually one of the smallest in the state as well. It's only 5 miles wide and about 13 miles long. And there's something very unique about this AVA that was really committed to in 2005 when the AVA was established. It was their commitment as an AVA region to the holistic farming and really herbicide-free farming, which took a little while to get to where they're currently at now, which is they just announced a few weeks ago that they're that all of their producers and growers in the AVA have committed to growing their grapes and vines glyphosate-free. So this is an important conversation that I want you to think about when we get further down. But really, what is the meaning of an AVA outside a soil type? What is the meaningfulness of an AVA, and what conversations can AVAs really have with the industry and with the trade? So I think really important conversations that should be had, and I'm super excited that Ribbon Ridge is, taking that mantle and moving there, considering they do have some of the, more founding vineyards in the Willamette Valley. It's a great approach. The Willackenzie marine sediments are the soil series, and then not only does Pinot Noir grow here, but there's also, as I mentioned earlier, some Gruner Veltliner, some Riesling. There's Gamay Noir, which is really successful in this AVA, and I would urge you to seek out. Pinot Gris, of course. There's even a little bit of Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot that's been found at some of the original vineyard planting sites. So, you're obviously not going to find a lot of those varieties in the marketplace, but you can definitely seek them out on the vineyards that are growing here and the wineries that are using them. Okay, moving into the Dundee Hills. So that's a lovely image of the Winderley Vineyards, which is, again, one of the older vineyards in the Dundee Hills as well. This was originally planted by Dickie Rath, and I think was some of it was Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. It's now primarily Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but you can see this is a nice southeast facing exposure, looking down towards the Yola-Amity Hills and the Eastern Cascade Ranges here. So the soils of Dundee are primarily volcanic, and they're Jori volcanic basalts. Jori is a very deep series of volcanic soil. It's very red when it's exposed to oxygen. It tends to oxidize deeply. But the unique thing about the Dundee Hills, it's has some of the oldest vineyards in the Willamette Valley. Number one being the Eyrie Vineyard. But this is almost entirely really deep volcanic basalt soils. The vines here really do benefit from having pretty deep established root systems that allow them to tap into the reserves of water throughout the growing season. So you don't get any dehydrated or overly stressed vines coming from the vineyards here. They actually have a real plushness to them and a sort of a deep cherry cola, almost Dr. Pepper type flavor coming from the Pinot Noirs found here. A lot of the vineyards are planted to the original clonal material, Pommard and Vadensville, being the major clonal selections here. And then some of the newer vineyards that were planted in the late 80s and 90s are the Dijon selections. We have, a lot of, this is a relatively small AVA in terms of acreage, but it's almost planted out. And I know that sounds funny when you see that there's only, nearly 3,000 acres planted, but there's a lot here that is higher elevation and too steep to be able to plant. So some of the highest elevation sites are at 700 to 900 feet elevation. And then most of the sites sit on the east facing flank, which is around 300, 400 feet elevation. This area is, home to a lot of the high point scoring wines and probably the most, recognizable international AVA within the Willamette Valley. So you have the Eyrie Vineyards, you have Domaine Drouin, Oregon, you have Domaine Serene, you have Circle Blosser, you have Stoller Estates, there's, Winderley, Domaine Roy. There's a lot of really classic styles coming out of the Dundee Hills here. Julia, anything to add? Any questions? I feel like I'm just talking.
Yeah, no new questions, but I do think, it's so interesting with Dundee Hills it's just so recognizable even within the Willamette Valley. And, winemakers are always saying, you can't generalize within the Willamette Valley, don't generalize by AVA. And it's really true, but there is just that core of really precise fruit and that like sarsaparilla cola thing that just seems to always, and really like that autumn leaf thing too, even with a few years of age. So it's really kind of amazing how Dundee Hills has developed this kind of pretty specific style. And yeah, I think that's all I was thinking about.
Yeah, that's really so true. And, to your point, before I lived and worked in the Willamette Valley, when I was blind tasting Pinot Noirs from Oregon, really the two areas that I could really nail wines from were the Dundee Hills and Ribbon Ridge. And then, of course, once I'd come here, Eola-Amity Hills as well. So pretty distinctive areas. But what I love about the Northern Willamette is that as the regions become further defined, it's really easy to carve out those stylistic differences and flavor profiles within the nested AVAs. So it's a pretty interesting and exciting time to be around the Willamette Valley.
No doubt.
This is Luminous Hills Vineyards. I just love this shot of this vineyard because this is really, the iconic vineyard in Oregon. And I don't mean that by meaning that Luminous Hills is the iconic vineyard, but this is what it looks like. It's surrounded by Doug firs and pine forests, and there's, you know, Oregon oaks scattered through the vineyard, but it's just very lush and verdant and green. And, you know, you're still really surrounded by the nature and the forest and these mountains that are so present. And you feel that coolness and freshness and mountain influence in the wines as well. So Yam Hill Carlton AVA is again another pretty well-known AVA in terms of some great vineyards being in this region. But as you can see, there is a little more variety in the soils. It's primarily Willamette sedimentary soils, but there are pockets of basalt as well, and also some pockets of alluvial and sedimentary soil. Loess soils. So Yam Hill Carlton buffers up against the Tualatin Hills AVA, the Dundee Hills, and Chehalem Mountains AVA, but it really sits pretty firmly in the Coast Range. And when you're standing in those vineyards, and you can see from the map here that there's, you know, quite a number of little ridge lines and valleys, and so it really does have a lot of different microclimates. So it does make it kind of hard to generalize a lot of the Yam Hill Carlton styles. So you definitely get the more voluptuous, purple fruited, higher alcohol, you know, resolved tannin, fleshier wines that come off the westerly facing sedimentary soils. But you also get a lot of these different pockets of alluvial, volcanic, and sedimentary and loess, all within the same AVA and positioned higher up in elevation, and getting more coastal influence coming through the Coast Range and from the surrounding forest that's there as well. So really great producers in this AVA like Elk Cove have a number of different vineyards on really specific soil types, and you can, you know, you obviously have a lot of blending material then to work with to make really complete wines. So a pretty cool AVA. Again, we're starting to see more experimentation into other grape varieties, but there's, you know, even within the traditional growers here, there's still a lot of Pinot Gris and Chardonnay as well. Did I see someone raise their hand? Sure. No. Okay. Moving from Yam Hill Carlton, actually, and I would also say that Yam Hill Carlton has, you know, that ability to have some really well-aging wines as well, because you can blend from the variety of soil types to create really structured, really complete wines. So you get a mix of wines that are like ready to drink and, you know, easy and forward and approachable, but then you also have a huge amount of wines that are really built to age as well. So again, know your winery, you know, discover the vineyards and go on an exploration through the AVA. Oops. Okay, Highland Vineyard is in the McMinnville AVA. This is an organically farmed vineyard, one of the oldest in the McMinnville AVA, and we're getting closer to the Van Duzer corridor influence here. And for me, the McMinnville AVA is pretty wild. It's a lot of basalt soils, and it's really, really thin topsoil. So the vines like really struggle here. Even when they're, you know, older vineyards, they can still look like fairly young because they don't have a lot of nutrients and a lot of carbohydrates that have been pumped into them. So these vineyards can be really angular and really muscular styles of wine. And you need to be really careful about how you handle them in the cellar, because there's a lot of tannin profile that can, you know, kind of be overwrought in some of these wines. But there's some great winemakers in the AVA that really know how to handle it. And there's a lot of blending material that goes into Willamette Valley appellation wines from the McMinnville AVA. It's a fairly small AVA. As you can see, it's 40,000 acres, but there's under 1,000 acres planted. So it's really, you know, only just starting to be explored by some of the producers there. Temperance Hill Vineyard, one of the, I guess, you know, this is an iconic vineyard in Oregon. It appears on many, many labels as an estate vineyard or a single vineyard vineyard for many producers. This is farmed organically and biodynamically by Crisp, and it's in the Eola Amity Hills AVA, which is really reliant on the Van Duzer corridor winds for cooling down. The Eola Amity Hills AVA is a north-south AVA, so the vineyards are planted on the eastern flank, which faces the Cascade Range, or the western flank, which faces the Coast Range. Those that are on the western flank tend to be on more sedimentary and also basalt soils. There's not too many that are planted on the Missoula Flood soils because they tend to be at slightly lower elevations. So primarily sedimentary and Nakaya basalt volcanics. Again, they are quite angular and quite darkly flavored wines because of the Van Duzer corridor winds. Every afternoon when you're in this AVA at around 3 or 4 o'clock, the winds start up and they just push and keep on pushing. And it's not like they stop on the western side of the vineyards. They actually push up and over the ridge of the Eola Amity Hills and come barreling down the eastern side. So even the vineyards on the heavily volcanic soils on the eastern side of the Eola Amity Hills, they are really heavily impacted by the Van Duzer corridor winds. You have a lot of vineyards here that are organic and biodynamically farmed. You have Pinot Noir that tends to be more tea, oolong tea, smoky, kelpy, umami, iodine flavors in the Pinot Noirs. And you even get that sort of salinity and seaweed note in the white wines from here as well. This is one of the most exciting AVAs for me for Chardonnay. I really think that the Chardonnay from the Eola Amity Hills is some of the most exciting in the valley, and it's partly because of this wind influence where the berries remain very small, and so you get this really structured, high acid, phenolic profile as well, which contributes to being really unique styles of Chardonnay, often from heirloom California clones. And then there's also a lot of, varietal diversity happening in the Eola Amity Hills as well. You have some of the oldest vineyards for Riesling and Pinot Gris. You have some of the oldest vineyards for Pinot Noir, but then you also have vineyards like Evening Land and Eola Springs and Bethel Heights, who have, Grüne Veltliner, Chenin Blanc, Gamay Noir, other plantings happening, and people are really starting to explore what other varieties can grow in the vineyards here. Granted, in very small amounts for now, but it's kind of exciting to explore this region as well.
Bree, a question came in the chat that's kind of interesting about whether or not you can tell from the finish specifically when blind tasting these wines from the different AVAs, like what kind of is the tell for these different ones. And I think for Eola Amity, I don't know that I would say a specific one for each of the AVAs, but certainly I think this is a good AVA to bring it up with, just because of those big blocky tannins, which, with McMinnville, Van Duzer, Eola, you're going to get that, but certainly combined with the really inky kind of like seaweed note you were talking about, at least for me, that's kind of what the finish does for this one.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, there's probably the 3 AVAs that I can get to in a blind tasting are, Ribbon Ridge has very, resolved tannins. They're quite silky, but the alcohol is quite present as well. So you get it more of a plush warming sensation in Ribbon Ridge, and bigger fruit profiles and more, riper tannin profile. So then in Dundee Hills, I get, a silkier tannin profile because they have that access to the water. There's just that silky spiciness that sits in the mid palate and has a lot of power, but a very gentle power as well. And then Eola Amity Hills sort of doubles down on that power profile. And to Julia's point, the blocky tannin profile needs some time to resolve. And so I find that, I will drink around the rest of the northern AVA Pinots before I'll tap into my Eola Amity Hills Pinots a lot of the time, because they just are savory and they are a little more wound up and a little more structured. And that's what I'll put in my cellar a lot of the time if I have other wines to drink from the other AVAs. So yeah, quite tea-like structure for the tannins from Eola Amity Hills. And yeah, that blocky, firm, kelpy structure on the back palate as well. Good question. Okay, so moving into the next, I guess, format for what we're exploring in the Willamette Valley. We're talking about the innovation that occurs in the Willamette Valley. Obviously, Pinot Noir was planted in the Umpqua Valley first in Oregon, but it was really commercialized pretty heavily in the Willamette Valley first. But the Willamette Valley was the first US region to commercialize Pinot Gris. And so that was an important step for this valley. And for, you know, when we learn about the varieties that are in this valley, US Pinot Gris is really at home in the Willamette Valley, and it's, even though it's not, you know, heavily planted as much anymore, I think it's still a really important aspect of our region that shouldn't be, you know, brushed over too lightly. So we'll go into that. We'll talk quickly about the unique clonal material for Pinot Noir that the Willamette Valley has, which makes it unique to other regions around the world for Pinot Noir. And then we'll also talk about the new nested AVAs. We'll touch on some of the new varieties that are being planted and the new styles coming from historical varieties. So we'll jump into this. Pinot Gris, as I mentioned, it's 60% of the Willamette Valley's white wine grapes. So the rest is split up between Chardonnay and Riesling, but it really is still our white grape in the Willamette Valley, and it's made in a variety of styles. It's never going to be a very, you know, low-priced style of wine, because our vineyards, you know, they're very high touch. There are a lot of handwork. Generally, our vineyards are touched around 17 times during the growing season. So you're always going to have, you know, a pretty, you know, relatively moderately priced wine from Pinot Gris, but it's made in a variety of styles. So higher elevations will create more of those pear and crisp green apple fruits. And then some of the riper styles that people can hang out a bit will get more of that baked pear, some honeyed ginger characteristics, more of that Alsatian style. And again, because we have such, you know, clear blue skies and warm summers, we're really able to allow the grape to fully ripen. We get some higher alcohols. And so for me, some of the, you know, best Pinot Gris that's made here can be cellared for a very long time. I had, you know, an Irie vineyard, one of the original vines, Pinot Gris recently, that was from 1988. And, you know, you don't really think about drinking Pinot Gris or white wines that are that old, but this had completely retained its freshness. It had gone into some, you know, interesting you know, kumquat and marzipan fruit, but it still had a really strong fruit core. And I think that's what the uniqueness of this valley is, in its ripeness, in its UV characteristics, but it still gets a pretty large temperature swing at night, which really cools it off. So a very unique area for Pinot Gris as well. And David Lett at the Irie Vineyards was the first person to plant Pinot Gris and really support that style. Dick Erath jumped onto that as well as did Dick and Nancy Ponzi, and also the Adelsheims. And those were really the core group of producers who began planting Pinot Gris extensively, began talking to other growers and other producers who were looking to come and move to Oregon about planting Pinot Gris. So they really spent the time doing the legwork in the marketplace to talk to the American public about Pinot Gris and what it was, because back in the 70s and 80s, this grape variety, you know, was basically unheard of in the US. So coming back to the clonal history of Pinot Noir, for me, this is what really makes Oregon quite unique in terms of the Pinot Noir profile and flavor profile. It is distinctively different to New Zealand, who have, the Dijon Clones and the Able clone. It's distinctively different from Australia, which has MV6 and the Dijon Clones. And it's distinctively different from California, because what was brought up to this region in the 1960s to be planted by David Lett and Charles Curry and Dick Erath were these lesser known clonal material that were looser. They didn't set as high a crop load as some of the other clonal selections of the same varietal clone. So Wadensville that was brought up was much looser. It was a much smaller berry. They were almost like the anti-farmers that brought the clones up here, because they were so much about making sure that the grape ripened here and that the quality was going to be high, that they chose the selections that were less vigorous and would have, less fruit set and usually some more like hen and chicken, small berries, as well as larger berries in the bunches. So very distinctive. Wadensville was the clone that David Lett brought up. And so this clone was actually imported from Switzerland by Dr. Harry Olmo and taken into UC Davis. And this clone is very, very bright fruited, really spicy, has a lot of lifted florals, and is kind of the lift and the energy framework for the Pinot Noir. When it's blended with Pommard, which is the other grape variety, the other clonal selection that was brought to Oregon in the 60s, primarily by Curry and Erath, it was a darker structured clone. So it's much more tannic, it's much more dark red fruits and some black fruits, but lots of foresty characters as well. And so when these two sit together in a blend, and most of the vineyards, especially the old vine vineyards that were planted here, were planted to Pommard and Wadensville. So this was often the typical blend coming from Oregon. And you get that very distinctive foresty, earthy structure, deepness of dark fruits, but also this vibrant, spicy red fruited lift coming from the Wadensville. Really, really characteristic. I don't find it in any other region in the world. And then the third clone that came in was the Charles Curry clone, which was what most people say is a suitcase selection that he brought in from Alsace, where he was finishing his master's. He was a climatologist who was also a teacher at UC Davis, and he also worked with David Lett and with Dick Erath. But he did a master's paper on cool climate amelioration theory. So this was the theory that the best place for a grape varietal in particular was where it ripened exactly at the end of the season to give it the most structure and complexity and flavor. That was where that grape variety was supposed to be. And so he brought with him a couple of selections of Pinot Noir, but he also brought with him other selections of Chasselas, Sylvaner, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and other selections as well. So Pinot Noir was really what stuck and really was what everyone was excited about in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And that continues to be the case. We're just finding, higher elevation, more distinctive sites for Pinot Noir. And even though the Dijon clones came in the late 80s, which tend to ripen early, accumulate sugar earlier, these clones were spread by Dr. Bernard throughout the New World. And so they're not distinctive, but they are reliable. So for farmers, it's a good, reliable source of ripe Pinot Noir. But what we're finding today is that growers are really doing mixed plantings of all of these clones combined, and then also bringing in heirloom clones from California. So Calera, Swan, 943, there's a whole selection of other clones that are coming in from California and that are being planted in the new vineyards as well. So the Pinot Noir landscape is getting more complex from a clonal perspective and getting more complex from an elevation plantings perspective as well. So these are the major Dijon clones. We don't need to go into them. They're fairly common around the world. So 113, 114, 115, and then 667 and 777 are the most, I think, distinctive and high quality that are found in Oregon of the Dijon clones. Okay, moving into the new AVAs. So Van Duzer Corridor is a new AVA that was established in 2019. It's just 50 miles from the Pacific Ocean. It is entirely sedimentary soil, and this is one of the lower elevations. So this doesn't go up above really 450 feet elevation. It's pretty low lying, which is why the Van Duzer Corridor winds are so impactful on the Eola Amity Hills AVA, is because it blows right over the top of the Van Duzer Corridor AVA. But the combination of low elevation and high winds really make these wines very high in acidity, very fresh, red-fruited, spicy, high tannins, a very much higher skin to juice ratio. So as this AVA develops, because there's only 1,000 acres planted at present, as this continues to be planted out, you're going to see a lot more distinctiveness coming from the Van Duzer Corridor AVA in terms of labeling. But for now, a lot of the Van Duzer Corridor AVA wines continue to be blended into Willamette Valley selections. And there's a few wineries down there that are really committed to organic and biodynamic farming, like Johan, and then Left Coast Cellars and Van Duzer Estate as well. So pretty distinctive. Again, I think there's a huge potential for Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc and other grape varieties that really benefit from having thicker skins here, but definitely a cooler climate, more reserved style of wine.
Bree, we had a question about, and I know we don't have a ton of time for this, but your take on Pinot Blanc. And I think, you know, I think every producer that I can think of in the Van Duzer Corridor makes one. What's your take on Pinot Blanc, Willamette Valley style?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was more of it, because I think it can be one of the best white wines planted here.
Yes.
And I think that it really shines in the AVAs that are heavily impacted by the wind. So Tualatin Hills, Chehalem, and Van Duzer, Eola Amity are definitely, prime candidates for really taking on Pinot Blanc and making it its own. I think that it has more character in those wind-driven AVAs as well. And so it can, combined with the phenolic content and structure, you can still get a greater ripeness coming from the fruit. So you get more distinctive flavor profiles, like, the grilled apples and fresh orchard fruits. I also love to see it. I think it's maybe Apollone. There's a number of people who are playing around with it in like different styles of oak. So Hungarian oak, chestnut oak. Yeah, there's a lot of fun to be had with Pinot Blanc. I just wish more people would plant it.
Me too.
Yeah. Okay. So moving into the next new AVA, which is the Tualatin Hills. I love this photo because it really does give you the sense of the Tualatin Hills AVA is pretty nestled into the Coast Range. And this is the AVA that should, also have that Tillamook corridor on it. So it's very wind-driven, very oceanic influence-driven. And you can see that sort of low fog that hangs in the lower parts of the valley, but the vineyards are up higher at higher elevations out of the fog line. So this vineyard is at around 650 feet elevation. But it has a very mountain fruit profile to all of the wines that come out of it. So this is primarily low soil. There's a little bit of volcanic basalt at the lower elevations as well, but primarily loess, which is, wind blown and driven from down the Columbia Gorge. It's the Laurelwood series of loess. It's pretty, it's varying levels of depth here. So when it's quite deep, you tend to get really phenolic, chalky, graphite structured tannins in the wines. So you get that even in the white wines as well. So you have Riesling that actually has like a pretty prominent tannin profile, as well as Pinot Noir that's quite graphite, very dark fruited, and red fruits as well, but very like dark, sappy, foresty notes coming from the Pinot Noir from the Tualatin Hills. This AVA is really important from a historical standpoint because it was where one of the first vineyards in the Willamette Valley was planted, and it's still in production. It was that vineyard that you just saw an image of before, which still has pre-phylloxera, Pinot Noir, and a host of Alsatian grape varieties that are still in full production on their own roots. So from a sort of living museum standpoint, this AVA is really important for that perspective, because there's not a lot of pre-phylloxera vines still in production. You know, most of the other vineyards were planted in the Dundee Hills and Shasta Mountains, and because there's so much vineyard activity and commercial activity around those vineyards, most of them have succumbed to phylloxera, and the vine louse has just spread through the vineyard. So they're all being replanted, but David Hill is a sort of an island in the middle of a forest at the moment that's really being well protected. So definitely an exciting place to watch. Moving into the Laurelwood district, so same soil type here. This is an image of the Ponzi vineyards, but you can see that this looks northeast towards Mount Hood and the Cascade Ranges. And these have deeper levels of Laurelwood loess soils. And so the wines here really differ compared, it's really about whether they're on, whether they're young vines or whether they're on higher elevations. So the higher elevations tend to have more volcanic soils, and young vines are really tapping into the loess soils. But once they get down deep, they're going into the basalt bedrock underneath. And so you tend to have young vines that have that distinctive sort of graphite, chalky tannin profile, almost a rustic tannin profile, and then go into the basalt bedrock, and then they start to get some real power and blue fruit character coming through. So age-worthy wines when they start to get into that basalt, but when they're just young vines in the loess, they're very vibrant and juicy and easy drinking styles. Really, an exciting AVA to watch as well, as we start to see more wines coming out under the Laurelwood AVA and see how they're being crafted. So that's the image there of the Laurelwood AVA. Primarily that whole northeastern flank of the Shasta Mountains AVA is Laurelwood soil, and still, a fair amount of vineyard land that can be planted. But this area is facing a lot of urban development from Portland because it's, only 25 miles from Portland. So this area, it does need to be protected from urban development. And this was really just a reminder that the Ridge AVA, is really starting to, define itself by some of its ethos and philosophies. And I think that's a real opportunity for a lot of other AVAs in the US to start to, have conversations around, why are their wines different? This wine, this AVA is particularly different because of its soil series, being a single homogeneous soil series. But now it's doubling down on its environmental commitments as well. So beyond Pinot Noir, so this is just again a reminder that there's 3.5 million acres of land in the Willamette Valley AVA. It's pretty large, and we still have a lot to plant out. So there's just over 25,000 acres planted. And what we're starting to see is as we move into the southern parts of the AVA, where it does get a little bit warmer, we're starting to see more Syrah, more Gamay, Cabernet Franc. Even in the Willamette Valley, we're starting to see a lot of Aligote, Chenin Blanc, Cabernet Franc, Gamay, Syrah, Trousseau, and other varieties being planted. There's even Blaufränkisch and Grüner Veltliner and Saint Laurent. So again, only limited by the conversation with growers and with winemakers, but it's an important conversation to have because of the climate change discussion, and the climate is changing, and a lot of the vineyards that are planted to Pinot Noir, if they're not older and established, they tend to be moving to higher elevations, And there's just an availability of more clonal material and varietal material now that we can plant in vineyards. And so with winemakers working all over the world, people are coming back and saying, you know, let's plant some Trousseau, let's plant some Sauvignon, let's plant some Mondouse, and see how this works in this area. So there's some fun like research vineyards, I guess you'd call them, about seeing, you know, where is the benchmark now for these for this region in terms of what it can ripen. And I'm personally incredibly excited about the Gamay that's coming out, and the Cabernet Franc that's coming out of the region. That the Gamay is incredibly spicy and retains its acidity. It's a really great fit for a lot of the region. And of course, it continues that Burgundian conversation, but, you know, the Burgundy is a pretty large region as well, and is also, you know, dealing with its own climate issues as well. So always something to keep in mind and something to think about here. And then the other thing is also that Pinot Gris, that, you know, was being, you know, sold as a pretty traditional style of Pinot Gris. There's now a lot of younger winemakers who are making skin contact Pinot Gris. You know, remember that Pinot Gris is a gray or pink skinned variety. And so you do get some tannin influence, and there's some really delicious skin contact wines being made from Pinot Gris that is sort of this light red character profile. So lots of fun being had by some younger winemakers in the region as well. And then finally, the region is, if nothing, collective and collaborative. So the Willamette Valley has the most AVAs, or nested AVAs, of any region in Oregon. It has a strong commitment to adopting sustainable certifications, and also to creating social sustainable certifications as well. There's a lot of regional collaboration in the form of creating educational events like Pinot in the City and Oregon Pinot Camp, where they really do all band together and work together to share their small region. They understand that they're all fairly small growers of, you know, 20 to 60 acres of vineyard, and, you know, they're mightier together. And that's what makes it such an enjoyable region to live and work in as well, is because there's so much sharing of knowledge and so much collaboration. So also important, as I mentioned, the urban development that's happening around the Northern Chehalem Mountains AVA, and to some extent the Tualatin Hills AVA. In the 70s, the Oregon wine industry worked to pass the Senate Bill 100, which was really about protecting hillside properties in farm and ag land areas so that they couldn't be developed, you know, by housing development. So recognizing that some of these regions did need to be protected, because Oregon does have a strong history of farming, and not just vineyard farming as well, but multi-land use farming, which is what makes it so unique. So when you come to Oregon and the Willamette Valley, you're not just coming to visit, you know, homogeny of hillside vineyards. You're actually, you know, passing through berry orchards, filbert orchards, Christmas tree farms, grass seed farms. There's an abundance of nurseries. It's a really interesting and diverse place to live, and biodiversity is more important than ever as you know, the climate continues to change. So very forward-thinking growers for the 70s and 80s, and this is something that, you know, is kind of renowned for Willamette Valley and for Oregon. These same growers also decided that they didn't want to be, you know, hemmed in by the federal standards for the label regulations. So they adopted the 90% rule for named variety on the label. So in other states in the US and other AVAs, you can be getting anywhere from 75 to 85 to 100% of the named varietal on the label. But in Oregon, if it's on the label, then it's a guarantee that it's going to be a minimum of 90%. And a lot of the times it is at 100%. They can write that on the label. There's some winemakers that are putting that on the label now, and that are also putting ingredient labeling on the label as well. So there's big commitments to transparency and sustainability happening here. Low input viticulture and enology is one of the certifications that you're likely to see on a Oregon label. It was established in the 90s by Oregon growers, and it really is about a whole farm and whole winery approach to being more minimal in the cellar, minimal in the vineyard, refraining from overuse of synthetic chemicals and fertilizers and herbicides, and really practicing sustainable farming. So this is a certification to look out for, and around 50% of producers are certified live, and that's probably a higher number actually in the Willamette Valley as well. And then here are some other sustainability certifications that you'll often see on the labels of Willamette Valley and Oregon wines. So B Corp Oregon has the highest number of B Corp certified wineries in the world. We have 9 in Oregon, and they are committed. That means that you make a commitment to providing a living wage. They have 401ks, healthcare for all their workers. It's a very equitable social commitment from the wineries. And then we have the environmental certifications. So Demeter certified biodynamic, Oregon has, and Willamette Valley has the largest certified biodynamic vineyard in the US at King Estate. And there's a number of others in the Willamette Valley as well. So very high commitment to biodynamic farming. Again, live certified, which is also in conjunction with Salmon Safe. We are on hillsides, we farm on hillsides. Most of those hillsides run down to creeks that run into rivers where coho salmon and other salmon species, spawn and live. So it's important for us to be protecting those habitats as well. And then DRC is Dry Roots Coalition. So it's still possible in Oregon and in the Willamette Valley to dry farm. And so there is a group of growers and winemakers that put this on their label and have created a foundation to be committed to dry farming. So no irrigation practices, and really making sure that that is a sustainable conversation within their winemaking as well. And if you have any more interest or any questions, this is Oregon Wine Month, so definitely reach out to your winery partners, to your producers, or you can hit us up at the Oregon Wine Board, or you can hit Julia up as well. I know she'll love me for saying that. But please reach out to your reps, reach out to your winemakers. There's lots going on. This is just one of 2 more webinars to come. Reach out to me anytime. It's just Bree@OregonWine.org, and you can find a whole kit and all of these presentations on the Oregon Wine Board website. You can put together your own education presentations, and I'm always happy to chat with you and help guide you through the conversation as well. Thanks everyone for being here. Julia, thank you for being an awesome co-host. I think I need you on all the time.
Thank you for all the great questions. Kept my fingers flying, but really fun stuff. Thank you for a great engaged audience. Yeah, fantastic questions. And thank you so much for being here, Julia. It was a real pleasure. And let's do this again soon. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Okay. Oh my gosh, so many questions.